Okay, here we are where we originally started the very first video. Do you remember when we made the first video in here?
Yeah.
Seems like so long ago. And this is the last lesson of this unit. So we want to finish by showing you one of the projects we started. What are we looking at here? What do you want to show them?
Some char.
So let's see. This is the basil that we had planted. So you can see now what's happened.
Basil grows.
It's starting to grow.
And I'm going to have a taste right now.
A taste right now? Well, we don't want to taste them yet because they're going to do some more growing. But we're going to grow them from this, and then we're going to plant them, and then they're going to get big.
Yeah, but when we'll have to cut them, and I had some behind my wind on my fire escape. Oh, I showed them.
The ones on the fire escape?
And
okay, how about we do this?
And we cut them, and then we watered them. They grew higher.
Why don't the students do the lesson, and we'll show them that one after the lesson, okay? All right, we'll see you guys. Okay, here we go, our final lesson for this mini unit before we take the final exam. Speaking of the final exam, which is going to be on June 4th, the practice questions are available now on Castle Learning. There is a first try, a retake. There's even a third try for you to practice those questions to get ready for next week's final exam. And because next week is the final exam and we want you to be able to focus on finishing strong, there will be no more guided readings. The 3 guided readings you were supposed to do for this mini unit are canceled. So make sure you're keeping up with all of the tasks. Have you already completed tasks 7 and 8? Today's task will be task number 9. It will be the last task for this mini unit. The final exam will be next week, 4th and 5th, Thursday and Friday. And the practice questions are already up and available. Guided readings canceled. After the final exam, we will do Unit Z, which is a current events unit. So here we are, the end of this unit. The Cold War is over. We are going to do 3 lessons in today's video, so we'll keep things moving. We're going to talk about the Berlin Wall. We're going to talk about a leader in the Soviet Union named Gorbachev. We're going to talk about the breakup of a country called Yugoslavia. So let's start with the first one. Aim 1 of these 3. Why is the fall of the Berlin Wall considered an important symbolic moment in the Cold War? So let's do a little bit of review. Let's think back to West Berlin during the Cold War. You're thinking of the Berlin airlift. How did the location of West Berlin lead to hostility between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? Let's look at a map. Here it is. In 1948, France, Britain, and the United States withdrew from West Germany and allowed their zones to become one country, West Germany, and East Germany became controlled by the Soviet Union, so it's a communist country. So the West, capitalist democracy, East, communist, and controlled by the Soviet Union. Now, let's look a little closer here at the map. Here is the city of Berlin. Notice Berlin was also divided up. The East was part of East Germany and was communist, and the western part of Berlin was technically part of West Germany, even though it was about 100 miles from West Germany. So, Stalin, the Soviet Union, did not want to allow this to happen. So, even though West Berlin was controlled by the 3 Western allies, the Soviet Union said, we cannot allow this. We are going to cut it off. And we're going to blockade the city and hope that West Berlin will give up. So the Western Allies flew supplies in for nearly 11 months in order to essentially contain communism, stop communism from spreading even just to West Berlin would have been seen as a loss for the West, and it would have been seen as appeasing Stalin, just like the Allies had previously appeased Hitler during World War II. Okay, so what's the problem, though, with West Berlin? Why is that a problem for East Germany? Many East Berliners moved to West Berlin to escape communist East Germany. So it's right there in their country, and as many as 2,000 people per week were moving from east to west. And once they were in West Berlin, they could board a plane and easily fly into West Germany. Let's look at it on the map again. So there's Berlin. People would travel from the surrounding red parts of East Germany into West Berlin, and then they would get on a plane, and that plane would fly out of the country of East Germany and into West Germany. So this was an economic problem for East Germany because they are losing workers. So they say we've got to put an end to this. We've got to cut off people from escaping East Germany. They need to stay. And think about why people were escaping. What must life have been like in East Germany if people are wanting to escape, right? So they closed the border in 1961 in preparation of constructing the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was very small at first. It was barriers that were set up quickly. So you can see in this photo an East German soldier jumping over the Berlin Wall in its early days. It's just some barbed wire there. By jumping over, he is defecting, meaning he is leaving his country, he's leaving his job as a soldier in East Germany to go into West Berlin. Eventually, the wall became more built up and became much, much more dangerous to cross, although people did still attempt to do so. So going back to the map, again, here's Berlin, the western part, the rainbow of colors there, surrounded by East Germany. People are going in. The idea here is people are not going to be able to travel in anymore when West Berlin is surrounded by a wall. So here's our vocab. The Berlin Wall, it was a wall surrounding West Berlin. It was not designed to keep people stuck in West Berlin. Keep that in mind. It's designed to stop the flow of East Germans going into West Berlin. It was up for about 28 years. And it was opened up, meaning it was essentially it was torn down in 1989 after the collapse of the communist regime in East Germany. Later, the entire wall was dismantled. After that happened in 1990, East and West Germany were reunified into one single country, which is the current status of Germany today. It's one country. It's no longer divided into East and West. So I want you to think back to this idea of the wall surrounding Berlin on all sides and the fact that this was part of a city, East Berlin, West Berlin, okay? How might the Berlin Wall have affected the people of East and West Berlin socially and economically? To give you an idea, I want you to imagine what life would be like if there were a wall separating North Brooklyn, which means the neighborhoods of Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and Bushwick from the rest of New York City. For example, some of you might not be able to get to school. You would not go to this school if you did not live inside of the wall, right? If you live inside of that wall and you have family or friends outside, you would not be able to see your friends or family. If you work inside the area contained in the wall, you would not be able to travel out of it, and vice versa. If you are, for example, a teacher who lives somewhere else in the city would no longer be able to work at our school. So this created a lot of social and economic problems. In this photo, a woman is peering through the wall to try to see her family on the other side of the wall. This is the early days of the wall when it was not as built up. In this photo, a woman is having a conversation with her mother on the other side of the wall because they lived in separate parts of Berlin. So when the wall went up, they were separated from each other. The wall went completely around West Berlin, and there were checkpoints. There were gates at which goods could be transported through. Remember, they had lifted the blockade, but the trucks that were transported through were checked to make sure that there were no people hiding in the trucks and that it was only supplies. Here's a diagram of the wall. So West Berlin was on one side, East Berlin on the other. There was this sort of no man's land that had barriers, and it had guard towers, and the guards were watching out for people to try and escape and cross the wall, and you could potentially be shot if you were seen doing so. Here's an aerial photo so you can see more what it was like. This is what surrounded the entire city. So here's West Berlin on one side, here's East Berlin on the other side, and then this zone in between, the wall area, is what's called the death strip. As part of this wall, along the entire top of the wall was this smooth pipe, which made it very difficult to scale and get over the wall. You could not really grab a hold of it and pull yourself over. Many people did try to escape. Some made it, but many people died trying to escape from East Berlin or East Germany into West Berlin. President Reagan of the United States famously gave a speech at the Berlin Wall declaring that the wall should be torn down. He's referring to Mr. Gorbachev, who we'll learn about in our next lesson. So eventually, the communist government of East Germany collapses, and the wall becomes opened up for people to be able to travel. So travel restrictions were removed. People could go between East Berlin and West Berlin all they wanted. It was incredibly shocking at the time for people. They could not believe that the wall was open and that they were able to travel. And eventually they started tearing down parts of the wall. As you can see in this photo, they're hammering it and using high pressure water to break apart the wall. And people even came to chip pieces of the wall off and take the pieces of the wall with them as memorials. Now the wall has been torn down, and in some cases, parts of it have been sent around the world as memorials. Or here you see, this is one part of the wall still standing, and if you look closely in the photo, you can see the line on the ground shows where the wall previously was. And so you can see now life sort of exists as normal. There's a road going right through where the wall was before, but at the time, it divided people. Now, so what? Why is the fall of the Berlin Wall an important symbolic moment? Walls are torn down every day. What's so special about this wall? Who cares? Well, the wall, the Berlin Wall, was part of this bigger idea, right? So the bigger idea was this line, this border that divided Eastern and Western Europe between capitalism and communism. So if the wall can come down, right, then maybe the Iron Curtain, the divide between East and West, can also end. And the Iron Curtain really is about this larger divide of the Cold War. So again, if the wall can come down, then maybe the Iron Curtain can be pulled back, and maybe the Cold War can end. Right? So that's a big step towards ending the Cold War, is the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany into a single country. Here's our second aim. We already mentioned this person in the last lesson. Gorbachev is the name. We'll look at him closely. How did Gorbachev's reforms help to move the Soviet Union towards democracy and ultimately bring the Cold War to an end? So let's do some review as it relates to communism here. Who controls the production of goods in a communist economy, right? Communism is about everyone being equal. There's no private property. Everything is shared together. And the government is going to control production. It's going to control property on behalf of the people. So everyone owns it together, but the government is going to manage it for the people. What are some problems that can result from this arrangement? Think about problems that happened in the Soviet Union before. They had a lot of difficulty, especially initially, producing enough food. They had a lot of difficulty in the beginning producing enough equipment for farming, etc. So some of the reasons that happens. First, low motivation. It doesn't matter if you work any harder in a communist society if you're not getting anything more for it. So the idea that people will work hard for each other only gets them so far, and ultimately people are not quite as motivated as if there's something in it for them personally. Poor management by the government of resources, not knowing how to produce goods, not knowing enough goods to produce, etc. This is also going to lead to corruption when there's not enough and only some people are getting what they need. Then the government officials, in many cases, are corrupt in providing those to their friends, etc., or themselves. And ultimately, this can lead to famine, as we saw in Ukraine. In fact, a forced famine which resulted in the deaths of about 6 million people. Well, we're going to look at a cartoon. This cartoon is from a previous Regents exam. Which system does the cartoon suggest is more successful at meeting the agricultural needs of the people? One of them is labeled free enterprise, which is what we would also call capitalism. Businesses are free. The government doesn't get involved. They just let it be. Think about when we sang that song in class. And the other cartoon says 5-year plans, which are often part of communism. Soviet Union had 5-year plans. Had we done our communist China unit, you would have also learned about 5-year plans in communist China. So, which one does it suggest does better? Clearly, in this case, the author believes that free enterprise, aka capitalism, is better at meeting agricultural needs of the people. Now, if we look at this diagram, the evidence does show that capitalist countries experienced more economic growth during the Cold War, even going back before the Cold War. Basically, from the Russian Revolution up to the end of the Cold War, the dark blue line is the United States. You can see the United States experienced the highest amount of growth. And the Soviet Union, it did grow, but it did not grow nearly as much as the United States did during the same time period. The United States probably grew, almost triple in terms of the size of their economy. So what? What does that matter? Well, in the 1980s, a dying Soviet economy was sinking. Their economy was getting worse and worse under incompetent government direction. Government-run industries turned out broken tractors, so they were sending tractors to the farms, but they were broken already. They were not working. Because they didn't have the right equipment, crops rotted in fields. So even though they were growing food, they did not have enough trucks to get them to the market, to the consumers that needed food. And government leaders decided what to manufacture. So as a result, people often waited years to buy a car or years to get a phone. In the mid-80s, a new reformer named Mikhail Gorbachev took the reins of the Soviet Union. In class, we normally discuss what reforms we think he should make, what should be done in order to improve the economy. We know he needs to improve the economy, but how is he going to do it? We'll skip the discussion and we'll get straight to what he did do, which is our vocabulary. So both of these are Russian words. First is glasnost. So glasnost was this idea of allowing more openness, less secrecy, and allowing some free speech in the Soviet Union. For example, churches were allowed to open. That had previously not been allowed. Books that had previously been banned were now allowed to be published. So people became allowed to speak more freely. When they were allowed to speak more freely, one of the things they talked about was the economy, and they criticized the economy. So the second change was called perestroika, which is economic reforms, and they restructured the Soviet economy to allow some capitalism. By allowing some capitalism, people were allowed to open small private businesses of their own. They now had a motivation to try to earn money for themselves, and both of these changes moved the Soviet Union away from communism towards capitalism and eventually democracy. Here's a picture of Gorbachev. You do need to know what he looks like because often you'll see him in political cartoons. And you should notice that he has this birthmark on his head. It's often called a port wine stain or port wine birthmark because it looks almost like wine was poured on his head. So if you see a political cartoon, someone has that birthmark on their head. That's Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union during the 1980s. All right, so what happens as a result of these changes? Some communists were very angry at Gorbachev's changes, and they thought this was making the Soviet Union weaker, so they tried to take control of the government. However, thousands of citizens rallied in the streets, and the coup leaders, the people who were trying to take over, gave up when the army refused to back their takeover attempt. So they didn't have the support of the army. They were just trying to do this on their own. They gave up. After that, many republics in the Soviet Union declared their independence. By the end of 1991, Gorbachev announced that the Soviet Union would no longer exist. Russia and the other 14 republics, think of it like if it was New York and the 49 other states, all became independent. This photo shows leaders of these Soviet republics. Think of it like states in the United States. And they're signing the agreement which eliminated the Soviet Union. So the Union doesn't exist anymore. It would be like the 50 states saying, the United States no longer exists, and now we're all going to be independent countries. So independent countries were established in 1991. So it went back to being 15 different countries instead of, as it had been before, one country that was united of all these different parts. So let's do a little review here, recap on the Cold War here. So during World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States were friends, but then that ended and they became rivals during the Cold War. The Soviet Union tried to increase its power, especially by installing communist governments in East Germany. The United States wanted to contain or stop the spread of communism so that it would be stronger. The United States formed an official alliance called NATO with Western European and other North American countries. So in response, the Soviet Union said, we're not going to let you be stronger than us. They formed the Warsaw Pact with countries in Eastern Europe so they could match the strength of the United States. Then, the United States gets bigger bombs. Soviet Union gets bigger bombs. The United States says, we're going to make them even bigger. Soviet Union says, we are too. They have some near direct conflicts, but they never fight directly, right? So they have these indirect wars. Korean War, Soviet Union supported the North, US supported the South. That ends. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet Union places missiles in Cuba. The United States and the Soviet Union almost go to war over that, but it's avoided when the missiles are removed. Vietnam War, similar to the Korean War, but with a very different outcome. North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union, wins the Vietnam War against South Vietnam, which was supported by the US. Vietnam becomes a communist country, still is to this day. Those are many of the events that occurred. Ultimately, what's going to end this war is money, right? So the United States and the Soviet Union had very different outcomes. The United States economy grew significantly. The Soviet economy got weaker. Ultimately, that leads to the Soviet Union collapsing and Russia returning once again to being an independent country after it lost those 14 other countries that were part of the Soviet Union. So the United States wins the Cold War. Russia elects its first president, who was democratically elected by the people. His name is Boris Yeltsin. Let's take a look at some political cartoons recapping what we've just gone through. So in this cartoon, what you see here is USSR, the Soviet Union, portrayed as a bear, and the Soviet Union is answering the door to these trick-or-treaters in 1989. One of them is the Baltics. The Baltics is 3 countries. One of them is Poland. One of them is East Germany. One of them is the country of Hungary. Those countries are trick-or-treating in this cartoon, and the Soviet Union is giving them reforms, but they don't want reforms. They want freedom. And it looks like the Soviet Union is nervously giving them the reforms instead of the freedom that they want. That's going to lead into our next cartoon here that we're going to take a look at in a moment. Here we go. Another cartoon. So this guy here is Gorbachev. You can see the little birthmark on his head. And Gorbachev is saying, I guess I'll call it a day. He's got a shovel. Looks like he's done some work here. He has done some work planting seeds of democracy. So he's the leader of the Soviet Union. He's planting seeds of democracy in the Soviet Union, moving away from capitalism. And there's some things that he has buried. So he kind of has the role of like planting a garden and also the role of a grave digger. He buries the Cold War because the Cold War dies, it ends. He's responsible for burying the arms race because the Cold War ended. The two nations were no longer involved in an arms race with one another. He has buried Soviet dictatorship. And then there's this birdcage in the back with Eastern Europe. And then normally there would be a bird in the cage, right? But there is not a bird in the cage, which symbolizes that Eastern Europe, the bird that would have been in the cage, has flown away and is now free. What do we mean by that? Here's a map of Eastern Europe. Remember, all the countries that are shaded there in the light red color were all Soviet satellites. They were communist countries controlled by the Soviet Union, even though they were not officially part of the Soviet Union. So, those countries, or we could put some birds here, all became free in either 1989 or 1990, were no longer communist. They became capitalist democracies. Another cartoon here, you can see Gorbachev again. He's standing looking at the Soviet symbol, the hammer and the sickle, and it has broken into 15 pieces, just like the Soviet Union, which was one country made up of 15 parts, broke up and became 15 different countries, as you see here in the map now. So there's no Soviet Union anymore. Russia still remains, and all of the other parts are independent countries. Which set of problems most directly contributed to the situation shown in this 1991 cartoon featuring Mikhail Gorbachev? So this is from a previous Regents exam. Right? So some of these possible answers are not related. You remember the Marshall Plan had to do with helping countries after World War II. The famine in Ukraine happened before World War II, a forced famine by Stalin. Invasions by foreign troops in Soviet cities under military siege. After World War II, the Soviet Union was not invaded by anyone because it was a nuclear power with the ability to destroy anyone that did try to invade, right? So that wasn't an issue. A deteriorating Soviet economy, so their economy was weak, and secessionist republics, meaning countries that wanted to secede or leave the Union, desiring independence. That's the answer as it pertains to that political cartoon of the 15 parts. I think this is the last one we'll look at here. Here he is once again, Gorbachev. You can tell he's got that little birthmark on his head. And there are dominoes. We talked about the domino theory, the idea or the fear that if communism spreads from one country to another country, then it is going to keep spreading and spreading and spreading, and the dominoes will continue to fall. Gorbachev here, though, is the last domino, and so now it's going the other direction. The dominoes are falling towards him, meaning he represents the Soviet Union, that communism is now going the other way, and capitalism is what's spreading to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev is still alive today. Here he is, photo taken a few years ago, but again, he is still alive. He is obviously no longer in charge of the Soviet Union after its collapse. So, speaking of the collapse, why does the collapse matter? Does this prove that communism cannot work as an economic system? Why or why not? So, Eastern European countries did not stick it out with communism. They went to capitalism. Soviet Union does not stay together, breaks apart into capitalist countries. Does this prove communism cannot work? Or is it that those countries were doing it incorrectly? For example, if we look at China, China is still a communist country. They do have many issues, but is that a better example of how communism should work or could work? North Korea is still communist, lots and lots of problems there. Vietnam is a communist country, and Cuba is still a communist country. Does this prove that communism doesn't work? Should all countries become capitalist? Does it prove that there's a need to make it better? All right, continuing on, third and final lesson of this video, and this is going to tie us all the way back to the beginning of the school year. So, aim 3. Does the conflict that followed the breakup of Yugoslavia confirm Thomas Hobbes' claim? Remember, he was an Enlightenment thinker. His claim that life without government would be a war of all against all. So we're going full circle back to the beginning of the school year. Here's what I want you to think about for the warm-up. Imagine that you arrive at school. Imagine we're in the building. And there are no leaders, no principals, no assistant principals, no deans, no teachers. What do you think would happen? Would it be just total chaos? Or would students create a system in which they could still learn? What would happen? Would it be just a lot of running around, a lot of foolishness? Would it be some learning happen? Would it be a mix? Maybe both? What is it like when there's no government in position to keep power? Here's our review of Thomas Hobbes. What did he think about human nature? Remember, he observed the English Civil War, just like John Locke, and he was convinced that all humans were naturally selfish and wicked, and that without governments to keep order, there would be a war of every man against every man, and life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. What type of government did he think is best based on this? So if he thinks people are evil, in his opinion, the best government was an absolute monarchy with the power of a leviathan, a sea monster. It doesn't mean there's an actual sea monster. It means that the monarch should have as much power as a mighty sea monster, so that the monarch could impose order and demand obedience. Here's the cover of Hobbes' book called The Leviathan. You should remember seeing this earlier in the year. He helped design this cover because he wanted to show that all of the people, you can see all the people in the body of this monarch, give up their rights to a strong ruler, and in exchange for this, they gain a society that has law and order. So you're giving up your rights in exchange for something. And that was a big deal because even though Hobbes still supported monarchy, he didn't believe their power came from God. He believed their power came from the people, and that the people were giving their rights to that ruler to get something out of it, that the ruler owed them law and order as a result. So, a leader who would be a good example of this idea of a Leviathan was Joseph Tito. Tito was viewed by many people in Yugoslavia as a benevolent dictator, which means kind and generous. So, even though he was a dictator, or you could compare him to Hobbes's absolute monarch, he provided people with law and order. They had educational opportunities, jobs, food, housing, regardless of their nationality or ethnicity within Yugoslavia. Okay? So, what happens? Well, Yugoslavia, we have talked about before. After World War II, this new country was formed. Remember, this is why the war started. Gavrilo Princip, who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, wanted all the Slavs of Southeastern Europe to be unified as one country, and that's what Yugoslavia was. Yugoslavia means South Slavia. So this country's formed after World War I. Then, after World War II, Yugoslavia becomes a communist country, but it's not aligned, meaning it's neutral. They didn't take the side of the Soviet Union, even though they were communists. They stayed neutral. Communist rule ends in 1990, though, and when that ends, it creates chaos in which 4 of the 6 territories declare independence, and it leads to serious ethnic conflict, which goes back to this idea of, okay, now that the benevolent dictator is gone, does this prove Hobbes is correct, that the breakup of Yugoslavia descended into chaos and war? Okay, we're going to take a look at a map of Yugoslavia here for a moment. You're going to see some cities, you're going to see some ethnic names, and this will hopefully spell out why these problems occurred in this region. Remember, Yugoslavia, referred to as the the Balkans is where Yugoslavia is. The Balkans were considered the powder keg of Europe. This area had a lot of ethnic tension before World War I, so it should be familiar from that. Gavrilo Princip was a Bosnian Serb. He was Serbian. He assassinated Franz Ferdinand. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. That's what starts World War I. You'll notice, looking at the key, the colors represent different ethnicities. And especially where Bosnia and Herzegovina are, there is a lot of ethnic tension in that area with all the overlapping colors. In fact, the yellow means there's no majority present. That means there are so many groups in there. There's at least 3 different ethnic groups in there. There's not one group that has a majority of the population. Okay, so there's a lot of tension there. I'm going to connect this to basketball for a moment. So there's a documentary film on ESPN. It's called Once Brothers. Recommend you watch it if you have access to any of the ESPN documentaries, or maybe you could look it up on YouTube. In the documentary Once Brothers, it's about the Yugoslavian national basketball team. And the team had some very, very good players, but they were of different ethnicities within Yugoslavia. And 2 of them were Vlade Divac and Dražen Petrovic. Vlade Divac's still very involved in basketball, even to this day. And there's a famous story about Divac, who, after the Yugoslavian team won the basketball world championship in 1990, the team was celebrating, and there was concern about some of the different people there who were supporting the individual parts of Yugoslavia. So someone runs down onto the court and they hold up a Croatian flag. Croatia was one of the 6 parts of Yugoslavia. So this would be like the United States wins a championship at the Olympics and someone runs out with, say, the New York State flag, or someone runs out with the California State flag, something like that, right? But at the time, there was a lot of tension among these different ethnicities. And Vlade Divac took the Croatian flag from this fan and he threw it on the ground. And he took a Yugoslavian flag, which is for the whole country, and he held it up. Now you say, okay, you might say, well, whatever. He was holding up the flag for the whole country. For the people of Croatia, that was seen as very, very insulting. And so it led to a lot of tension, not just within the country, but even when Vlade Divac was playing basketball here in the United States and Dražen Petrovic playing here in the United States, the two no longer got along with one another, and people were even threatened for if they were to associate with Vladi after that. So here's a map of Yugoslavia. You can see it's shaded there in purple. It breaks apart basically in 1991. You can see when all the parts became separate. You can see Croatia on there, becomes its own country in 1991. All right, so what? So now we're getting a glimpse at what life would be like without government, which is what Hobbes had talked about. This war breaks out in what's called Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's the area that had the most ethnic tension. As a result of the collapse of Yugoslavia, the Bosnians, who are primarily Muslim, and the Serbs, who are primarily Christian, have a conflict with one another that lasts about 4 years. And the Serbs sieged the city of Sarajevo, which is actually where Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated. So it's an important city historically. But they sieged this city. They blockade it like Stalin had blockaded West Berlin. There were approximately 400,000 residents that were trapped in the city. They were cut off from food, medicine, water, and electricity. Even United Nations peacekeepers were unable to stop the violence, and by the end of the siege, nearly 12,000 civilians in Sarajevo had died. Take a look at some photos from this time period. This is the government building at the center of Sarajevo burning. So, imagine that's their state capitol building or their White House, for example, burning. And that's just a symbol of how chaotic things got during this time period, right? So, government building destroyed, newspaper building destroyed, right? The significance of this is it's destroying people's ability to stay informed and be able to communicate about and be up to date as to what's going on, right? It stops the spread of information. In this photo, a cellist is playing in the partially destroyed National Library. Now, he's not playing there because he has to. He's trying to draw attention to what happened to their library, which is, again, a source of information, a source of learning about the arts, etc. People waiting in line to gather water, and you can see that they're gathering water from the river with jugs, and this is because there was not water being pumped into the city for them, because it was being sieged, it was being blocked off. You can see the line extends along the riverbank, across the river, and probably goes much, much longer than that. Residents collecting firewood, finding bushes, basically, to burn in their fire. And this is not that long ago, right? This is in the 90s, right? I was alive during this time period. I remember this stuff going on. So it's very, very shocking to see people having to resort to this due to this conflict. One of the ways people were able to survive is a tunnel had been dug under the siege, and they were able to bring some food, some supplies, some humanitarian aid, such as medicine. And it's said that without this tunnel, things would have been much, much worse. So the tunnel saved much of the people who survived. After the siege ends, this is what the city looks like. Completely destroyed all over the city, including, I think this is a very significant photo. The Olympics had been held in 1988 in Sarajevo. And the significance of that is the Olympics is this idea of bringing the world together. It's this idea of peace and friendliness and working together, cooperating. You can see in this photo, the Olympic rings are destroyed on this Olympic monument, and the monument itself has bullet holes all over the monument, just showing this idea of sort of the destruction of the cooperation that they had once had. All right, so here's our task. You're going to read this section, A Lost Bridge Between East and West, and the section called More Questions, More Bodies. After you've read those, you are going to write a response. I want you to think back to the beginning of the school year, okay? When we talked about Hobbes and John Locke, most of you agreed with John Locke that people were naturally good and could learn from experience. But now you've learned the course of a whole year, a lot of events that happened in global history. that might change your mind. Maybe they don't. But I want you to think about, who do I agree with now? Was Thomas Hobbes correct? Does this confirm that Hobbes was correct? Life without government would be a war of all against all. Or is there another example that would disprove that? Or is there another example that would add on to this? Are there any other examples from global history from this year? So you can either focus on Yugoslavia, you could focus on even the breakup of the Soviet Union, you could focus on other events that we've talked about this year. Was Hobbes correct or incorrect? Support your claim with evidence and include a counterclaim and prove the counterclaim wrong. Thank you as always. This concludes our mini unit for Cold War ending. Be sure to get ready for that final exam. Okay, so we're going to show you the plants out on the fire escape here, so you can get a look. What are they going to see?
This is
Which one? What kind are there?
Cha, Liga, 60, Pola.
So we added some. We got some mint, basil, chives, oregano, thyme, some tomatoes. So those ones are doing pretty good. Joaquin, where'd you go? All right, I guess he took off. We're gonna sign out. We're gonna say bye. It's been fun ending this unit, and tell them good luck on your final.
Good luck on your final. You should make a garden like me.